All right, part 2 of chapter 2. So the first part was all about crime scene investigation, the CSI team, the job descriptions. Part 2 is all about evidence collection. So this part's pretty short as well. So the very first thing we talk about when we get to this part of the chapter is principle of exchange. And this is from Dr. Edmund Locard. You should recognize his name. He was the first person to help create the first crime lab in the entire world in France. And he was very active in forensics, and he began to realize that evidence can be easily contaminated, and anything we touch or we come into contact with can be easily contaminated. So he came up with what he calls, it's self-named, Locard's exchange principle. Basically, it says when a person or an object comes into contact with another person or another object, a cross transfer of physical material can occur. So if you bump into someone, there's a chance of cross transfer. If you bump into the wall, there's a chance of cross transfer. If you are in a car and it hits another car, there's a chance of cross transfer. Okay? So 3 things that can affect that actual exchange, that transfer: the intensity of the contact, the duration of the contact, and the nature of the contact. So those are the 3 things that can determine the extent of transfer. For example, the intensity. Okay, if you're in a fist fight, there's a way more chance of getting someone's clothing fibers on you, hairs, anything, versus just brushing up against each other in the hallway as you're walking past each other. The duration, how long are you in contact with this person? If it's just a one punch and you're done, but if you're brutally beating someone, that's going to affect the transfer. And then just the nature of what's happening. Like I said, is it something casual and minor, or is it something more intense? You do not have to write this down, but just some of the main things that are found in a CSI evidence collection kit. So a lot of times on TV shows, they have it in like a duffel bag or a briefcase or something. And there's a lot they have to carry with them because they don't know what they're going to stumble upon at a crime scene. So they always have a notebook and pen to document, rulers for photography. They may have chalk or crayons. Now, they don't really do body outlines like they do in the movies, but they do use it for like marking on walls or floors, like bullet marks or scrapes or something. Magnifying glass, flashlight. Now, the one thing that drives me insane about crime scene shows is they always have the lights turned off, no matter the time of day, and they're always using flashlights. That's not real life, okay? Obviously, they're going to turn the lights on if possible, but a flashlight can then help you see with even more light. Disposable forceps, because once you use them, you don't want to contaminate something else by reusing them. Perhaps a scalpel or razor blade to maybe tear off a piece of the wallpaper or, rip off a piece of the drywall or something. Gauze and sterile cloth may be needed for victims or for collecting biological evidence. Swabs or medical droppers for presumptuous testing, which is testing that can be done right at the crime scene. Any type of material needed for evidence packaging, so the tape, marks, markers or tags for like outdoors, so like little flags that stick in the ground, or they may just have like the triangular evidence numbered markers. Same thing with flags, those go outdoors. Evidence bags of all sizes and types, plastic, paper, evidence envelopes, evidence folders, lifting tape, paper for paper bindles. We'll talk about that in a minute. They also usually carry a small vacuum with a filter on it so they can vacuum a crime scene, collect all the tiny evidence that could be there, and then obviously that changes out every time they use it. Fingerprinting equipment, including lifting tape, dusting, powders, brushes, anything like that. Then gloves, face mask, shoe covering, coveralls, everything to protect themselves from potentially contaminating the crime scene. You don't see that often because it kind of takes the fun out of it. And then just plastic or metal containers that are non-breakable. So that's just an overview. You do not have to know that. I just wanted to give you a general overview of all the things they have to take with them. So as far as collecting evidence, we already talked about this last part. You have to document before you collect. So you document by photography and or sketch, but usually definitely photography. And then there are specific forms you have to fill out documentation wise, and then you can actually collect and package. So once again, this is just a general list of some evidence. Liquid and arson remains should be in airtight metal containers. They kind of look like paint cans, like right here, that you can hammer on the lid. And I would usually ask the class why. If you think about liquids and arson remains, why do you not want to use anything but this? It's because it's sealable, it's airtight, so you don't have to worry about the liquids evaporating. Arson remains, you don't want to potentially have the gas, the accelerant, and the gas that was produced evaporate. So they can actually test the gas that's not, it's invisible to us, but it's still in that canister. Any type of biological evidence which comes from a living thing must be packaged appropriately. If it's still wet, if it's some type of bodily fluid or something that's wet still, you want to put it in a breathable container made of paper until it dries. So if they have a bloody shirt or something, they would put it into a larger paper evidence bag to dry, and then once it's dried, they may repackage it. Paper bindles are good for trace evidence. Once again, it has to be dry trace evidence. A paper bindle is just a small piece of paper. You put the evidence in the center of it, very small evidence, and then you fold it to the left, fold it over to the right, fold it up, fold it down. So it kind of creates a little envelope. And then you take that little paper bindle and put it into another container. So for example, if they were using this small plastic bag, they would put it in a paper bindle first. That's only for trace evidence, so very small, very easily lost. And then other evidence, it just depends on what it is. They may use a paper bag, a paper envelope, a plastic container, a plastic bag. They do have these little like pill box. They have a lid that clips on, so there's no chance of it opening. Biological swabs, if they're swabbing someone's cheek or something, get put into a biohazard container so people know, since there are diseases that can be transmitted through bodily fluids. Okay, so how do you seal, correctly seal evidence? And I'm just using a paper evidence bag for this example, but it would be the same no matter what type of evidence container you're using, assuming that this is possible. There are some types of evidence containers that can be sealed differently, but that's a more advanced level. Okay, so you're going to seal with evidence tape in such a way that the entire clothing is covered, and if someone wanted to open it, they'd have to rip it. So this is incorrectly sealed. As you can tell, if someone really wanted to get in here, they could. Okay, so instead of putting it vertical, this person should have put the tape horizontal across and also around the back. So you don't even want to just put it to the edge, you want to loop it around. So if it was tampered or opened, you would be able to tell. Evidence tape, there's different kinds. Some of it's just red, it says evidence on it. Some of it has more writing on it. Some of it has a place for signing and dating. So this would be correctly packaged. Notice it's completely sewed across and it goes the whole way around. So if someone wanted to open this, they really have to make an effort and it'd be visible to you. You also need to initial or signature, at least initial, because you're the one collecting it, and date across the tape, half on, half off. Now, some types of evidence tape, like this one, has a place to sign and date here, but a lot of times they will still sign half on and half off, like both of these pictures show. Now, why is that? Why do they sign half on and half off? Well, because if someone tried to remove this tape, they would cut off half of the signature and date, so someone would be able to tell that it was missing. Yes, potentially they could cover it up, but. And then all sealed evidence, once it's been packaged in the appropriate container and sealed with tape appropriately, you also have to include an evidence tag or an evidence label, and then a chain of custody document. Evidence tags and labels look different depending on, once again, the type of brand you buy, but it usually will say the case number, the evidence description, place it was found, date and time of recovery, who it was recovered by, and if there's a suspect and victim, an offense. So it's just kind of covering all the questions. Chain of custody document. Oops, I'll get back to chain of custody in a minute. Reopening evidence. Okay, so I know this is not taped well. I need to like take my own pictures. This is a horrible tape job. First off, it doesn't go the whole way across. Second off, it's not evidence tape. It's just Scotch tape or masking tape. Unfortunately, this did come from the forensics textbook, so I'll have to do my own. But anyway, here's my original piece of evidence. Pretend it was actually sealed and dated and signed appropriately. Okay, you want to open the evidence on another side, not the initial seal. So if this was my initial seal going horizontal across, I would want to cut either horizontally across the bottom, or I want to cut the side off. You want to basically cut or open the package in such a way that you maintain the initial seal. Now, there are some containers that you can't maintain the initial seal. For example, if you had that paint can for arson, you can't open it on the other side. So in that case, you do want to make sure you actually rip the evidence tape, the initial seal, note that you were the person that did so, and then reseal it yourself. But if you can open it on a different side, you would open it this way. And then when you're done, you would reseal it inside in a new bag. So you seal the inside to make sure that nothing falls out if you need to do that. Then you would put it in another evidence bag or container and seal that appropriately with your date and signature, and then update the chain of custody. Basically, the key is if you can maintain the initial seal, maintain it. Okay, here's what a chain of custody document looks like. So chain of custody is basically a documented and unbroken list of everyone who's come into contact with that evidence. A lot of times people forget unbroken in their answer when they define this. It's documented and unbroken. Every single person who touches the evidence must fill this out. So some of them are on the backs of an evidence tag. Some of the evidence tags have the chain of custody attached to the bottom. Sometimes it's a separate document. It just depends. It's usually some type of sticker or tag. So all the chain of custody says, doesn't matter which one you look at, the bottom here or the bottom of this form, it's from, to, date, and time. So received from John Smith, because he was at the crime scene, he collected it on this date, at this time, by me, my name. And then I am going to give it to the lab technician. So then I put received from Lee Winkowski on this date and this time by lab tech. And then the lab tech is going to give it at this date and this time to evidence storage. And then evidence storage on this date and this time is going to give it to the court. So it's just a documented list of every single person that's come in contact. You want to try to keep the amount of transfers to a minimum. You don't want too many people handling the evidence. That's when mistakes happen and things get contaminated. So you just have to make sure that you're constantly updating that. And we will have a lab on this once you guys are back. Okay, trace evidence. I've already talked about it. I kind of said what it was. Trace evidence is very small but measurable amounts of physical or biological material. Basically anything small enough that it could be easily lost or contaminated. Because of that, you want to make sure you secure trace evidence almost immediately. That doesn't necessarily mean package it, but you could be putting something like a plastic dome over top of it to protect it so it doesn't get blown away or it doesn't get picked up accidentally, or whatever type of trace evidence it may be. So anything super small you can think of is pretty much trace evidence. So hairs and fibers, small blood droplets, small blood spatter, paint being chipped away from a doorway or something, skin cells, glass fragments, pollen, soil, leaves, a used tissue is small enough it could be considered trace evidence, fingerprints, small amounts of bodily fluid, drug paraphernalia, anything that's small that could be easily lost or contaminated or evaporated or anything like that. All right, now we're going to get into the two main types of evidence. The two main types of evidence are direct evidence and circumstantial evidence. Direct evidence is basically evidence that, if authenticated, supports an alleged fact. So these are most likely firsthand observations that can be justified with another observation. So for example, an eyewitness account, and there's many other people who saw the exact same thing. Police dashboard footage. So, they pull you over and you end up fleeing the scene. Okay, that's direct evidence. Security footage. That could be anything from a store's security camera to your Ring doorbell footage. Confessions that have been taped. Okay, not just like so-and-so told me. These are the people. Now, that doesn't mean that confessions are truthful, but they can be pretty damning. So basically, direct evidence is firsthand knowledge, and it has to be authenticated, but it's easily done so because it's taped, it's recorded, something like that. Circumstantial evidence is basically the complete opposite. So it's indirect evidence. It's used to imply a fact, but it's not supported directly. You'd have to do more testing, more investigating to determine its importance, its authentication. It could prove a link between a crime and a suspect, or a crime and a victim, or anything. But like I said, you have to do more testing. It's not obvious to you as soon as you see it. So anything else you can think of besides direct evidence: weapons, a footprint, a fingerprint, fibers left at the crime scene, whatever it may be. Direct is a pretty small set of examples. Circumstantial is everything else. So because of that, you can have physical circumstantial evidence, or you can have biological circumstantial evidence. Physical is anything that does not come from someone living. So a lot of people say, well, fingerprints come from someone living. Yes, but a fingerprint is just a pattern left behind. The same thing with a footprint. So it's still physical. Shoe prints, tire impressions, tool marks, glass, soil is considered physical because it's just dirt. Fibers, weapons, bullet casing, shells, I'm trying to think of something else. Basically anything you can think of that doesn't come from a piece of living something. So like I said, on the flip side, biological circumstantial evidence, usually, DNA, so any type of bodily fluids, hair with the root, skin cells, anything that's DNA based. Plants are considered biological because plants have DNA. Pollen comes from a living plant. Natural fibers like cotton and silk. Like I said, fingerprints and soil, not biological. They are physical. Okay, then we can break it down even farther and say class characteristic evidence or individual characteristic evidence. And like I said, this is usually circumstantial. So class characteristics of evidence or class characteristic evidence, basically you take a large group of people and you narrow it down. Okay, so this piece of evidence narrows it down to this smaller group of people or things, but you still don't know that single source. So think about if I said we have the entire high school in the gymnasium and I say a crime has been committed, someone robbed the vending machine and they had a blue shirt on. Every single person with a blue shirt would come to the cafeteria. I just took a large population and I narrowed it down, but it's still a class. It's still a population, not just one person. So blood type is a really good example of a class characteristic because I can determine the blood type based on laboratory investigation, but that doesn't mean I know the person, okay? Because there's lots of people that have lots of similar blood types. But if it's A positive and you have B negative, then I know it can't be you, okay? Shoe prints, okay? If I can figure out the size and make of that shoe based on the tread, I could say, okay, anyone that has this shoe is a suspect. It could be the entire basketball team if you all have the same shoes. Okay, then I take size into consideration. Well, 5 of you have size 9. Okay, so I still don't know the exact person, but I'm getting closer. Eyewitness observations a lot of times help you narrow it down if they're accurate. So blonde hair, 6'5". Well, then I can rule out Joe, who's 5'7" with, orange hair or whatever. Individual characteristic evidence or individual characteristics of evidence it's exactly what it sounds like. This actually pinpoints a specific person or specific thing with certainty. DNA, number one, okay? Even twins, identical twins do have the same DNA, so that is a little tricky. But fraternal twins do not, and obviously then everyone else has different DNA. So DNA is a great indicator. If you have fingerprints, that's even better, because no two people have the same fingerprint, even twins. So once again, class characteristic of evidence has a broader spectrum of examples. Individual characteristics is pretty much just DNA or fingerprinting. Okay, and then lastly, the other type of evidence, which we kind of talked about in chapter 1, is testimonial evidence. Testimonial evidence is basically you take an eyewitness statement and now you use it in court. So just because you're an eyewitness doesn't mean you have to testify. They may take your statement and use it in court. It doesn't mean you have to testify. But if you're choosing to, you would go as a witness on the stand. You would state your observations, and hopefully they're truthful. And that's it. The problem is, as you saw in the 60-minute eyewitness video, the victim, she thought she saw, this man, and she was certain of it, and she testified in court for that, and then she was wrong. So, testimonial evidence can be important, but it also has a big impact no matter if it's truthful or not. And we hope that obviously people aren't being untruthful. Testimonial evidence is the least reliable by far. Direct evidence is probably the most reliable because you know it right away, but actually circumstantial is the most common because it's just a broader spectrum. Testimonial is the least reliable, direct evidence is the most reliable, and then circumstantial is the most common type of evidence. Okay, and lastly, just a brief overview. Once they have the evidence collected, they send it to the appropriate lab, and the forensic lab analysis process happens. It's not like you see on TV where you can float in between types of testing. You're pretty much specialized to toxicology or to fingerprinting or to blood typing, whatever that may be. The lab results are then sent to the lead forensic investigator and or lead detective. And then because of that processing, they can begin to piece together what happened based on that evidence, because that's all we care about. The evidence as it stands as a fact, and how can it get us to their answer of what happened. Sometimes they'll use the evidence and compare it to witness statements or identities. So if they say that, they think these skeletal remains are from this missing girl, but they end up being male skeletal remains, then, obviously that counts that out. If they think that this person, the suspect, was at this site and then they find to test the pollen is not from that area of the state, then, that can rule someone out. So that's why these results are so important. And also, detectives are not scientists, so a lot of times they do need that forensic investigator to explain it to them. And that's why it's so important for the forensic investigator to have good reporting skills, because they're going to have to potentially report on their findings in the court. Just like in the Casey Anthony video, they had the forensic pathologist and saying that, they really find it hard to believe that this was not murder whenever the little girl had tape across her mouth. Who would do that if they weren't trying to suffocate them? So like I said before, direct evidence is more convincing, it's more reliable, but circumstantial is more common. Okay, so that is the end of chapter 2. Pretty short chapter. I hope you're doing the forms on these. It's a good review. We'll have a study guide, and then your test on chapter 2 is going to be quick next Wednesday, October 7th. So if we're still virtual, I'll be doing it the same way as we did chapter 1. If we're in person, we'll talk about it then. I don't know, we'll see what happens, but quick chapter. There is a lab that goes with this, so I hope to see you soon. And then our next chapter is on fingerprinting. So I hope we are back in person by then.